As we're growing up, we start to realize our childhood imagination is different from actual reality. So, for example, I quickly realized as a kid I was never going to be an adventuring archaeologist or an intergalactic smuggler, or likely ever play a game of checkers over hot chocolate with Yasmin Bleeth in front of a roaring fire in a winter cabin. Yeah, I know that was probably too specific. The point is that we rarely meet our childhood heroes, and our childhood imagination rarely comes to life. So it's really weird and jarring to be in front of one of my childhood fantasies right now.
This is it. This is definitely it. We're close on this one. I can feel it.
For years on this channel, people have asked me when I was a kid what toy line did they not make that you desperately wanted. And I always said Ghostbusters. And then a lot of them would say, but they did make that. And I said, well, no, that's the cartoon. They didn't make them for the original film in the summer of 1984. And then people get confused and like, yeah, there were toys for that. I'm like, no, there weren't. And then you have to show them the evidence. And of course, there weren't any. And I know that because I saw it in the summer of '84 in the theater and then wished beyond wishes that there had been action figures. And in my childhood mind's eye, I could perfectly visualize what kind of figures I wanted. This was 1984. This was the beginnings of the great heights of G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero. And those figures had such great articulation. They were like the cat's meow of action figures. I naturally envisioned that the Ghostbusters would be ideal as 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joe style action figures. That was what I envisioned when I was 6 years old. I will never forget holding on to that wish, that want, to eventually turn that Christmas catalog page and see those right there that I could ask for from my mom and dad. It never quite happened. No, it never happened. I guess the reason I say quite is because I would use Flash from G.I. Joe as my stand-in Ghostbuster because he had the laser rifle with the cord that went back to the pack. So it was kind of like having a Ghostbuster. Not quite, but it was the closest thing I could get. And of course, I didn't have 4 of them, and Flash wasn't being sold anymore, so I couldn't get any more. So it was really frustrating. And then when the cartoon stuff came out, it was like, well, I'm glad that we finally have Ghostbusters something. But it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted G.I. Joe style figures with the khaki coveralls on, with their backpacks, possibly the car. Like, my needs felt simple, and yet it never materialized. It never happened. Ghostbusters as a movie franchise had very little interest in toy content at that time. Obviously now, with our generation having grown up and said, where was this all these years? We'll throw money at it. Now they target adults who are starved for stuff from Ghostbusters back then, and they just throw it at us. All these different companies do it. But even with all that, even with the 6-inch figures and the 12-inch scale figures and all that stuff, my want was always for Ghostbusters that would integrate with my 80s toys. So like they would integrate with my G.I. Joe, my Buck Rogers, my Star Wars, all of those lines that came out in 3 3/4 inch scale. That was what I wanted to see. I never thought I would see it because it's been 4 decades of these companies doing a lot of different things for adult collectors, whatever they wanted. The Ghostbusters merchandising has run the gamut with that. And so I just naturally never thought that would really happen because it was a childhood imagination thing. It was me coming up with the image of these figures in my mind at the age of 6. And then holding on to that, knowing that it would possibly never be a thing because it was me as a kid. And then suddenly Hasbro announces this Plasma Pack. And not only are they 3 3/4 inch size, but they're not doing them in their modern, super articulated construction. They're not doing them like vintage collection Star Wars figures. They're going back to O-ring, which is exactly what I visualized when I was a kid because O-ring was dominant. It was, like I said, it was the best there was for action figure tech back then. Now it's retro and old school, but back then it was cutting edge. And I thought to myself, wait a second. They're finally bringing out 3 3/4 inch Ghostbusters figures for the first time, but they're not doing it in the modern style. They're doing it in the old school, Real American Hero, retro O-ring style. And they're doing it based on the first movie. They're not basing them off Frozen Empire or Afterlife. They're doing them based off the original film in the original uniforms. And it's the 4 guys that I always visualized starting from the age of 6. Exact same construction that I wanted, exact same scale, exact same accessories, which is the proton pack and a few little extra bits. And I started to wonder, how did they pluck this out of my imagination? This plasma pack is like they've lifted my childhood want from 6 years old right out of my brain and handed it to me. Which, as you know, coming from me regarding Hasbro, that's a rare statement, because Hasbro, maybe they're the broken clock that's only right twice a century. I don't know, but in this particular case, they not only delivered on something I never thought I would see, but they didn't deliver a crap product at the same time. They knocked it out of the park. There's no complaint that I have with the Plasma Pack figures. They have the right amount of detail to look like a 3 3/4 inch O-ring style figure would, but the right amount of simplicity that it feels like you could have bought these on cardbacks in 1984, that summer. They have the proton pack with the wand, and they've even sculpted their hands to prioritize holding that wand with both hands, even though they are G.I. Joe swivel arm construction, which is really nice. And what's also interesting to me is that because Ghostbusters came out in 1984, the G.I. Joes at that time still would not have had the ball swivel neck joint. They would have still had just the side-to-side neck joint, and that's what these have. I know that's probably just a cost-saving measure because Hasbro probably doesn't want to do ball-jointed necks anymore for retro figures, most likely, I assume. But it is an interesting coincidence that these figures represent exactly what G.I. Joes were doing in 1984. So they are contemporary to their own time. They're just 40 years late. I love the way they've sculpted them. I love the colors on them. I love the fact that they don't feel cheap, especially given that the price for all of them was very reasonable when you consider you're getting all 4. So all of this is really working in its favor. I couldn't believe that I was looking at these. I couldn't believe it. They even made sure to give Venkman his untucked pants legs, which I would have thought with something like this that they just announced pretty off the cuff and then delivered on a few months later, that they wouldn't have bothered with that for the purposes of reuse. But they sculpted different lower legs for Venkman, which is awesome because it means they all stand out in their own way. But otherwise, their bodies are pretty much reused, which is totally understandable. The other accessories that they come with are the Ecto goggles, the Ghost Trap, and the PKE meter. Now, the Ecto goggles I thought at first were going to be worrisome because that tiny strap looked like it was going to snap when I was putting it around Ray's head, but it didn't. It seems flexible enough, whatever the material is, but it stays snug, which is nice. It's not just hanging around his neck or anything. You can position it, above his eyes like he often did in the films, which is great. And of course, you can have him hold the Ghost Trap. Now, the Ghost Trap's handle is sort of soft and flexible so that it doesn't strain the thumbs, which are also a more flexible material than what they would have used in the 80s. So I don't think there's any danger of the thumbs breaking off. That being said, for any Ghostbuster that's going to hold an alternate accessory from the Neutrona wand, I would recommend you put that accessory in the left hand, because the left hand's grip doesn't necessarily have to be as snug as the right hand's grip to hold the Neutrona wand. The third accessory, the PKE meter, is where this problem really rears its head, because for some reason they made the accessory oversized, which on its face isn't an issue, but they made the handle for it way too big. Now, you can still get the PKE meter in Egon's left hand, that's not a problem, but when you do, I would highly recommend that you, even though it looks a little weird because it's not the way he would have carried it in the film, you have him hold it closest to the base of the PKE unit itself, where the handle is narrowest. That's just free advice on my part. I'm not saying it would threaten to break his thumb. I'm just saying that you don't want those hands so permanently expanded and distorted by secondary accessories.
Stop that!
So the Ghostbusters are great. They all have their individual name tags, and they have really, really nice printing of the Ghostbusters patch logo on their shoulders. They have great joints. They feel like brand new G.I. Joes when we were kids. Like, there's no skimp in quality on these. But there is a caveat here that's very disappointing, and it has nothing to do with the figures themselves. It has to do with the Ecto-1. They made a Plasma Series 1/18 scale Ecto-1 back for Afterlife, if I recall. They then redecoed it to make it Ghostbusters 1, the original. And in doing so, they sort of soft re-released it when they announced this Plasma Pack series of figures, because they said, oh, well, that 1/18 scale Ecto that we put out like way too early, given that we were developing these 4 figures that would have gone with it, we're gonna kind of like bring it back out. It's the same toy from, however many months ago it was like a year and a half prior. But it was clear that this toy was designed to be a standalone display piece with a few moving parts that wasn't ever really pre-designed for action figures. So they bring this thing back out, and yes, it looks good. It looks in scale. The 3 doors for passengers open up. You've got the rear cargo hatch door, the rear bed door that opens up properly. All that's great. The detail on the exterior and the interior is impeccable. And then you start to try and put the figures in. You can get figures in the driver seat and the front passenger seat with a little bit of work. Like, they will fit in there and it looks fine. Like, the steering wheel's a little hard to get around for the driver, but once you do it, it's fine. It's just a little bit of a frustration. Doors close, no problem. All right, you got 2 characters in the front. Great. It's when they allow you to open up that 3rd door and you see those rumble seats in the back that face each other just like they do in the Cadillac Miller Meteor ambulance. And you're looking at it and you're going, wait, the seats themselves are too high. So when you try and sit the figures down in the seats, turn their knees 90 degrees and seat them in there, they are now too tall for the roof of the Ecto. And then on top of that, they put the seats too close together. So even if you had enough headroom, if the seats were low enough, the 2 characters can't even get their legs in together to face one another because they're going to be right on top of each other, even if they had enough headroom. So we find ourselves in a situation yet again, like we did 38 years ago with the real Ghostbusters Ecto-1, where you have room for the 2 guys in the front, but in the back, you just end up having to throw them in there like they're firewood, because they have the seats, but the seats aren't designed to actually work. They're designed to be some kind of like static display vehicle that Hasbro put out before they ever considered making characters in generally this scale. And what makes that doubly frustrating is this Ecto comes with the proton pack sort of gurney that pops out from the back of the Ecto, and they've designed the proton packs so that they clip into this specific gurney. So they put thought into integrating these action figures accessories into this Ecto-1, but they didn't redesign any of the other crucial areas to allow 2 of the 4 Ghostbusters to sit in the seats that are already in there designated for those 2 people. That is really frustrating. So the Ecto-1 ends up becoming an unofficial storage case for the 4 figures and their accessories, as long as you pile the other 2 guys back in there unceremoniously in the rear bed. But otherwise, you can only use it as like a static display piece. You can't really have the characters interact more realistically with the vehicle itself. And that, frankly, sucks. That's like a huge oversight. The saving grace here is knowing what we know about how toy companies did this kind of stuff back in the 80s. I'm not giving them a pass on this for now because they actually did put the seats in the back. But back in the 80s, they just would have done like what they did with the real Ghostbusters one, where there were no seats in the back. They only accommodated it for 2 people in the front, and then you just had to throw the other guys in the back. That's more of a headcanon way to just get around the annoyance. But knowing that the entire vehicle wasn't even made for figures to begin with, that makes it more obnoxious. While we're on the subject of displayability of both the figures and the vehicle, since display is probably everybody's main priority, I gotta tell you, if you don't already have the Playmobil Ghostbusters Firehouse, you really should get it if you wanted a realistic sort of display that really wows for your Ghostbusters with your man cave or your display shelf or your studio or whatever you have. Because even though inside this firehouse everything is scaled down markedly for Playmobil style figures, the sort of main edifice of this playset is a very, very nice display piece for these Ghostbusters figures. And while the Ecto just barely fits through the door because it's a little wider than the Playmobil Ecto, it can't quite get out the door unless you take the ladder off and unless you take that sort of like radar sensor off the top, which you can, they're both removable, but it would take that for it to go clean through the door of the firehouse. As you can see, It fits in the firehouse just nicely, and you can back it all the way up into the firehouse, just like in the movie. This firehouse is a great addition because I don't see them, if they've already at Hasbro decided to repurpose a non-figure accommodating vehicle to be the sort of default display vehicle for this range of 4 figures. I don't really see them ever springing to do a purpose-built firehouse for them. And the real Ghostbusters firehouse isn't going to work because it's way too upscaled. It's going to make them look crazy small. Now, you could say to yourself, well, that's actually going to be closer to the way the firehouse is in reality. All right, you know, whatever you want. But the garish colors, I think it doesn't have the right sort of like, it doesn't have the right magic to it for these figures from the first movie, because it's more of a cartoon-based toy. I think this looks great with these figures, and this is what's going to be my new Ghostbusters display. I am so happy with these figures, not just because they feel like they jumped out of my childhood imagination, although that is really wowing, but just the quality that Hasbro put into them. I'm so happy with them that I am seriously considering finally retiring my childhood real Ghostbusters from display permanently, packing them up, and just making this my Ghostbusters display for my toy display room in the studio. That's how happy I am with these 4 figures from the Plasma Pack. My Ghostbusters have finally arrived. I have nothing bad to say about them at all. The car, they could have done some adjustment on that. You could have tried harder, Hasbro. You could have gone that extra mile on those tweaks to the original mold to make that a true Plasma Pack accommodating Ghostbusters Ecto-1. You cut corners there and it shows. But the figures themselves, which is what was dominant in my 6-year-old mind, uncannily perfect to what I was wanting 40 years ago. Uncannily perfect. I don't even know how and why this happened. I don't care. You're going to hear me say this. I'm going to say it probably very rarely in my lifetime, but I'm going to say it here right now. Thank you, Hasbro. Thank you for doing this. I don't know how you pulled it off. I'm glad you did it to a nice level of retro quality. In this moment, you are a legitimate phenomenon.